I'm really quite touched by this introduction. Thank you. That means so much. Let me first say I'm so grateful to be here. So thank you to all of those who've been involved in organizing this event. It's a special return for me. I spent significant time here at the EUI while I was still a PhD student. And even then it was very clear to me just how special the Max Weber program is, the particular constellation of disciplines, just how many people there are, the sort of intensive cohort experience that you get here, which is very rare at the postdoc level, make it such a special thing. And so I'm excited for all of you and especially thrilled to be talking to you all this evening. So as you just heard, I'm going to speak today about my book, which began as my dissertation and then recently came out with Princeton University Press. So this is a book about the modern state and the world order to which it corresponded. In the most schematic terms, we talk generally about the emergence of the modern state out of a welter of overlapping orders and jurisdictions, out of a messier world of lords and vassals and estates and rival powers wielding competing forms of right, all partaking in forms of rule that were not necessarily understood in territorial terms, but rather as porous, socially embedded relationships. We talk about the emergence of the idea of sovereignty as a single and highest power, presiding instead over more uniform, legally homogenous territory with a monopoly on legitimate force. So that's sort of one major meta-narrative about the modern state. In a second one, we then talk about the globalization of the state form. As late as the 19th century, the world was populated by a wild variety of political formations, ranging from huge industrialized empires spanning continents and oceans to all kinds of smaller formations, including polycentric sultanates and indigenous communities living according to their own law. Today, by contrast, we look out over a globe almost entirely segmented into sovereign states or would-be states, modular, clearly demarcated, theoretically equal under international law. Driving this transformation was, of course, decolonization, as anti-colonial revolutionaries overthrew imperial rule and founded scores of new states, especially in Asia and Africa in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So these two processes sit at the heart of our political narratives of the modern world, and my book revisits them both from a perhaps surprising place and perspective, namely the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburg Empire dominated the map of Europe for hundreds of years until it collapsed in 1918 at the end of World War I, just over 100 years ago. It stretched from today's northern Italy all the way to western Ukraine, and from southern Poland all the way to Croatia, by the Czech lands, Transylvania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Slovenia. It was a compound polity home to intermingled populations speaking some 12 different languages and professing many religions. Since its dissolution, historians of the Habsburg Empire have focused largely on two related issues. First, the reasons for its collapse, with shifting appraisals of its weakness and strength, modernity and backwardness. And second, the nature of the nationalisms that ostensibly brought it down, from ancient ethnic enmity to so-called national indifference. Vital as many of these questions remain, my book returns to Habsburg Central Europe with a different set of questions about the legal and intellectual history of empire, sovereignty, and statehood, seeking out its place in this larger story of the transformation of a world of empires into a world of states. I tell a new story about the empire as a crucible for our contemporary world order. So the book does so along three central avenues. It begins in the aftermath of the European revolutions of 1848, as the Habsburg Empire was convulsed by decades of constitutional experimentation in the face of rising provincial demands for political rights. So I show first how these structural experiments in imperial organization directly tackled a set of transitions usually deemed constitutive of the modern state, especially the transition from private patrimonial rule to abstract public authority, and from pluralist, differentiated legal orders to singular, uniform, unified ones. Unlike in France, no revolution had swept away all the old legalities and rights of the Ancien Regime. The full complex of dynastic patrimonial law needed to be argued over and converted manually into modern equivalents. Unlike in Britain, the Habsburg government had been forced into a written constitution, meaning these adaptations could not unfold backstage, gradually, fuzzily, absent-mindedly. The empire's legal order had to be publicly articulated. And unlike Germany, the empire's rulers and thinkers could not appeal to some ostensibly organic national unity of das Volk to ground the unity of the state, as the dominant historical school of law did there. Its increasingly volatile multiplicity of peoples made that proposition absurd. How many folk souls were there, right, to underpin the state? No, the Habsburg monarchy would have to chart an alternate path into sovereign modernity, to think its way toward different theories capable of anchoring public order in an age disenchanted with gods and kings. Combined, these characteristics turned the Habsburg lands into a remarkably explicit workshop for the attempted production of abstract, singular sovereignty out of multinational, dynastic, composite empire. The case allows us to eavesdrop on the refashioning of the body of the king into the body politic, as live, ever unfinished history rather than static retrospective theory, replete with unresolved problems and inconsistencies, myths and imaginative leaps, and many significant consequences. Second, I recover the place of the Habsburg Empire in that other foundational process underpinning the emergence of a world of states, the demise of formal empire and the rise of the nation state in its wake. We rightly associate this story with the decolonization of Asia and Africa in the decades following World War II. But certain parts of the story crystallized at the end of the previous World War with the dissolution of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. Under the watchful eye of the international community, assembled first at the Paris Peace Conference and then as the League of Nations, a string of newborn sovereign powers appeared in the empire's place, including Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria and Yugoslavia. Now, important substantive differences distinguish this chapter of imperial dissolution from the one that followed the next World War, not least regarding race and economy. The post-imperial is not the same as the post-colonial, as Peter Holquist has reminded us. But the end of the Habsburg Empire raised legal questions about the nature of post-imperial sovereignty that would remain persistent features of the subsequent global history of decolonization. Here too, the Habsburg monarchy occupied a distinct place in the cohort of empires, Ottoman, Russian, and German, that collapsed at the war's end, as the whole of its former territory was converted into independent post-imperial states. Legal conundrums surrounding the messy end of empire and the creation of new states, especially discontinuous sovereignty and the succession of rights, obligations, and territories, were thrown onto the main stage of 20th century international order, largely by the implosion of Habsburg rule. The legal stories and theories developed to make sense of that transition would echo in the subsequent decades through South Asia, Africa, and beyond. Third, legal thinkers from this corner of the world exercised a radically outsized influence on the evolution of modern legal philosophy in general and theories of the state in particular. To a startling degree, the ideas that shape our discourses about sovereignty to this day were born in the Habsburg lands in the decades before and after the empire's collapse. A state, according to international law's standard codification, comprises four things: an effective government, a clearly defined territory, a stable population, and an effective government. An effective government and the capacity, to enter into relations with other states. The original architect of this test was Georg Jelinek, son of Vienna's most famous rabbi. Across a prolific career, which culminated in a chair in Heidelberg, where he was a close interlocutor of Max Weber after anti-Semitism drove him from Vienna, Jelinek forged many of the disciplinary building blocks of public and international law. He also inaugurated a methodological revolution that would bear spectacular fruit in the work of his student, Hans Kelsen. One of the 20th century's most important legal philosophers, Kelsen was also a product of the Habsburg experience. He studied when the empire was at its apogee and taught at the University of Vienna as it came crashing down. He masterminded Austria's post-war constitution and served as a judge on its constitutional court before anti-Semitism caught up with him too. The political storms of interwar Europe tossed him first to Cologne and into a legendary confrontation with Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, then to Geneva and eventually to Berkeley. He escaped Europe aboard the SS Washington as Hitler's armies marched on Paris. Along the way, he developed an extraordinarily complete philosophy of law. Known as the pure theory of law, its analytical insight, explanatory power, and global influence are matched only by its degree of difficulty and the controversy it generated. Integral to its architecture was a radical new account of what the state was. It explained how law could turn a messy, contradictory reality into a singular, unified legal entity. It sprang from that quintessential Habsburg dilemma and perhaps quintessential Habsburg alchemy: how to spin multiplicity into unity. Then, as the empire collapsed and he and his collaborators reckoned with the birth and death of states, they were pushed toward a radical new account of the relationship between sovereignty and international law. So the book explains those ideas and their significance and shows why it was not an accident that they emerged in the Habsburg lands. The empire became such a hothouse of legal innovation in both academic theory and constitutional practice, precisely because existing theories could not make sense of it. To confront questions of state and sovereignty in this intricately layered, prodigiously complex empire was to confront the radical limits of legal concepts and to be propelled towards new ones. It might be ironic that an empire saturated with historical rights and traditional law birthed the most strident apostles of legal modernism, but it is not inexplicable. On the contrary, this book shows how orders of thought evolved in dynamic tension with orders of rule, and why innovation and anachronism proved such intimate associates rather than each other's opposites. If the book places a spotlight on Jelinek and Kelsen, both mainstays of law school histories and textbooks, but conspicuously neglected by historians, it also offers a broader contextual explanation for the many other thinkers from the Habsburg Empire who shaped 20th century legal history, including Eugen Ehrlich, a pioneering scholar of legal pluralism, and Hersch Lauterpacht, a giant of mid-century international law. This book thus presents the intellectual history of modern sovereignty as an attempt to make sense, as a form of sense-seeking, a reach for ideas and methods that could explain or really construct the coherence and legitimacy of the state. Which brings us to the philosophical and conceptual problems that lie at its heart. I excavate two pivotal legal fictions that still animate our legal systems today: sovereign singularity and sovereign immortality. I'm in conversation with legal philosophers and political theorists, even as I try to historicize these underlying figures of thought. Both these fictions proved especially difficult in the Habsburg lands, allowing us to crack open their histories and the fantasies, fears, and epistemologies they involved. So first, its singularity. The major theorists of sovereignty, like Hobbes or Baudin or Rousseau, had placed the singularity of sovereignty, like the notion of a single, supreme, undivided power, at the core of their very definitions of sovereignty. But the view from the Habsburg lands made one skeptical about those ideas. Such theories, Georg Jelinek asserted, could not make sense of sovereignty in Central Europe. Whether one looked at Austria-Hungary or Imperial Germany or Switzerland, one confronted compound polities marked by varieties of amalgamation or disaggregation, polities that were judged irregular or abnormal, or provisional, or simply incomprehensible by legal theory. Jelinek diagnosed the underlying problem. All these thinkers, he thought, the Hobbes and the Baudin and so on, they all came from England and France. They reasoned from Western European experiences and presumed them universal norms. But what if the theory and not the so-called irregular state was to blame for the resulting incongruity? Why could some sorts of states generate models and be abstracted into theories and not others? Jelinek set out to correct matters, devising notions of sovereignty that began with plurality rather than singularity, and that placed imperial configurations at the center. A generation later, Kelsen confronted the same problem, but took a different path, out-theorizing the theorists to offer a blisteringly sophisticated but prodigiously abstract new philosophy of law. Surveying the messy pluralistic world around him, a bricolage of peoples and polities, he felt sure that the ultimate source of the state's legitimacy and coherence could not be deduced from this chaotic material reality. That way lay madness. Thus, the whole hot new approaches at the time coming out of sociology and psychology were mistaken in their presumption that the state's foundations could be anchored in empirical phenomena. He turned from materialism to logical philosophy, to epistemology, to Erkenntniskritik in the original German. His theory turned on the idea of a single ultimate Grundnorm, or basic norm, an original norm from which all other norms flowed. Now, he was quite clear that this existed nowhere in the material world. There one saw only clashing forces and volatile alliances. It was a purely hypothetical proposition, a formal rule about the possibility of rules themselves that was implied or presupposed every time a judge or a jurist presumed there was such a thing as valid law. So it was not material, but it was not imaginary either. It was present in the empirical world as a logical presupposition for all legal thought. In this basic norm, and in the basic norm alone, lay the singularity of the state. So with high modernist pathos, Kelsen tried to ground the ultimate coherence, unity, and legitimacy of the legal order without recourse to gods or kings or natural right or material power or nations or class or any other essentialism, but in logical inference alone. The pure theory's crystalline propositions made them eminently portable. It was quickly translated and deployed all over the globe. Yet its very abstraction, I argue, stands as an unmarked archive of the Habsburg experience. The pure theory's sky-high philosophy existed in inverse proportion to the detailed complexity of what needed to be solved. One had to rise so far above the ground to order that chaos into cosmos. So the second major fiction is that of sovereign immortality. That is, the idea that the state remains the same unchanging legal entity despite the coming and going of governments, constitutions, indeed all of us. Juridical immortality can be traced back to foundational early modern theories of sovereignty. It responded to concrete needs and objectives. Unless the state persisted despite the death of a monarch or the fall of a regime, it could not guarantee the intergenerational continuity of public order, of rights, of duties. In Thomas Hobbes's phrase, the state required an artificial eternity of life. Ernst Kantorowicz famously recovered the medieval origins of the doctrine in the king's two bodies, one fleshed and mortal, the other understood as abstract and perpetual. But this is no mere dusty scholasticism. The state's juridical agelessness, the stable continuity of its legal self within the flow of time, remains a crucial enabling fiction for our systems of law, facilitating everything from state treaties to public debt. One prominent international lawyer recently called the state an intergenerational transition mechanism, as though it were a portal connecting us to those long dead and those still unborn. So if historians of political thought have lavished attention on the idea of state immortality as it emerged in the medieval and early modern periods, no one seems to have wondered so much about its fate and meaning in the modern period, in an era of imperial upheaval and collapse that could not but put huge pressure on the background assumption of sovereign perpetuity. In picking up that question, The Life and Death of States offers something like a history of ahistorical things. It pursues the historical life of entities, that is, states, that claim to be immune to time's passing. It presents legal perpetuity as something actively made, desired, and doubted by historical actors, and analyzes the intellectual scaffolding such continuity required. At the center of the book, then, lies an interest in the historical production of abstraction, an interest in attempts to escape the movement of history itself. As one debated the empire's order and then reckoned with its collapse, both of these fictions came under extraordinary pressure. Though myriad politicians and scholars strained and struggled to make it all make sense, the particularities of the Habsburg lands pushed all theories of sovereignty to their breaking point. A contrast here might help explain my approach. There's another very good book, recent book on the same sort of topic by Jana Osterkamp in Munich. She likewise observes that the categories of 19th and 20th century Staatswissenschaften failed to make sense of this plural compound empire. She argues that, as a result, we now should understand it as federalism, even if contemporaries did not. But see, I think there's something historically interesting and revealing precisely in that failure of categories, right? And in the drive toward them. Rather than wishing it away or trying to overcome it, I'm interested in making it the substance of the history itself. My methodology here draws some inspiration from the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg. In his Prospect of a Theory for Non-Conceptuality and other essays, Blumenberg suggested that metaphors granted access to that which could not be translated back or forward into pure conceptuality, that which could not be reduced to abstract language, those aspects of the human life world that were conceptually irredeemable. Through them, one might excavate that buried stratum of stimulations and needs that generated theoretical curiosity, the life world and what he called the catalytic sphere that sparked metaphors, the perplexity for which they stepped in. My path here is parallel. Rather than take sovereignty as a particular idea or thing, I present it as a problem, a stimulus, eliciting ever new attempts to solve, to theorize, to understand, and to order. Each constitutional configuration, like each academic theory, struggled to contain or tame its object, never quite finding coherence or fixing meaning, never quite achieving political or intellectual stability. In recovering that history, I'm attentive to the affective desire for order and logical coherence and the experience of its elusiveness, treating these things not as some sort of incidental backstage to a real history of law or ideas, but as the main stage of the story itself. The Life and Death of States is an intellectual history of theory not working, an intellectual history of not having the words. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and put a little more empirical sort of flesh on these theoretical bones. So here is a map of the empire from my book up on your screen. The Habsburg Empire was a time capsule of European history in which different phases of state formation remained alive in the present. Its formal legal architecture preserved the logic of its medieval and early modern formation through a series of dynastic unions, right? So you see all of these traditional lands marked internally there, Bohemia, Moravia, and so on. On paper, it remained a concatenation of distinct polities that were united only through the body of a shared monarch, what historians would later call composite monarchy. In the era of enlightened absolutism, this legal structure had been overlaid, but crucially not dissolved, with robust organs of centralized government based in Vienna. The 19th century added yet another layer as national movements emerged among the empire's language communities and demanded a place in the empire's political architecture. So the empire was many versions of itself at once, a kind of layer cake of sovereign history. What was a state? Here was the place to find out, or at least to ask. When one tried to square the empire with the category state, numerous plausible interpretations emerged, all of them contradictory. Only two things are certain, reflected one law professor. First, it really was a monarchy. Good. Second, it was not a simple unified polity, but rather a plural compound one. Everything else, he wrote, is doubtful or at least contested. In particular, how many states does it consist of? What are they called? What is their legal relationship to one another? Was the Habsburg Empire one state, two states, three states, four? In recent decades, a stream of important scholarship by Tara Zara, Peter Judson, recently emeritus here at the UI, Kate Brown and others has shown how Central and Eastern Europe was gradually sorted into national communities out of a welter of more fluid, overlapping identities. But this is not only true of nations. It had to be sorted into states too. In the decades after 1848, the Habsburg Empire tried out different versions of that sorting in a series of constitutional orders, culminating in the Ausgleich, or the settlement of 1867, which transformed the empire into two separate and equally sovereign halves. So it converted the logic of composite monarchy into a new bifurcated sovereignty, a hyphenated state formation called the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So had sovereignty been doubled or divided? How could a state be two and somehow always one? The dualist theory, R.W. Seton Watson would later quip, is almost as theological as the doctrine of the Trinity. These constitutional experiments formed part of a much broader story of sovereign self-consciousness and imperial codification. A new self-consciousness about sovereign status and inter-imperial competition had spurred projects of codification and rationalization in the blue water empires and the continental ones alike, most notably in projects of reorganization and codification that swept the Ottoman, Russian, Japanese, and Habsburg empires in the 1860s. All of these polities felt similar pressures to articulate and assert their sovereignty in mutually recognizable ways. Through this process, sovereignty became the lens for new maps of the world, a prism for demarcating and comparing self and other, and for analyzing and regulating the interstate community. In their re-articulations of Habsburg sovereignty, Central European actors located themselves on these new world maps. Unsatisfied with the available terminology, Georg Jelinek coined the concept of state fragments or Staatsfragmente to capture an in-between level between the state on one hand and a province on the other. Some political formations, he argued, were subordinated under a state government, but not entirely merged with that state. Not states themselves, they presented what he called rudiments of a state. So this genre of quasi-sovereignty captured the ambiguous status of the Austrian lands, he thought, but also the settler colonies of Australia and Canada, which likewise possessed state organs, though not full independence. So concepts like these arranged the international landscape along unfamiliar lines. Small wonder then that the Habsburg gallery of constitutional experiments echoed and traveled, especially for those dissatisfied with the unitary state and restlessly searching for wider horizons of sovereign possibility. Austro-Marxist proposals for the legal personality of national communities had afterlives in the Soviet Union, as well as in the League of Nations minorities regime, and later in the political theory of multiculturalism. Habsburg layered sovereignty and dual-track administration shaped the thought of Austrian economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who transposed that schema upward when they conceived of international economic governance as a stratum lying atop and bracketed from state sovereignty. The model of the 1867 settlement, in which two states might be fully sovereign and independent and yet still looped together, was discussed by Ottoman intellectuals as a model for Egypt, by Irish nationalists as a template for their autonomy, and on the subcontinent as the partition of India and Pakistan loomed. Here I'd like to draw out one central feature of these constitutional debates and restructurings. Seeking greater regional autonomy, claimmakers from these various lands appealed to their old rights and prerogatives, the historical rights of the Kingdom of Bohemia, say, or the Kingdom of Hungary. Originally, these had been essentially feudal rights of the estates, and especially the aristocracy, that the monarch had pledged to uphold as he acquired those principalities over the course of the early modern period. Right, so this is the very logic of a composite monarchy. You acquire another land, another crown, but that unit remains a unit, right? And you govern it according to its own laws. Now, in the very different world of the 19th century, they reimagined these traditional patrimonial rights and privileges as the rights of states. States that had been sovereign prior to Habsburg rule and that had never formally renounced that status. They pointed to the long string of coronation oaths and other dynastic agreements in which the Habsburg monarchs had always affirmed those traditional rights. But these claims faced serious evidentiary headaches. They had to try and explain how these historical lands still existed as ostensibly quasi-sovereign states, despite centuries of Habsburg imperial rule and the material reality of a relatively centralized empire. So politicians from Hungary, Bohemia, and elsewhere got creative. They argued that the historical rights remained good, legitimate law, despite, or especially when the Habsburgs had failed to respect it. Valid law, they argued, could not be overridden by mere facts. Polities could persist as legal norms, pieces of suspended legitimacy awaiting renewed recognition and the restoration of full factual life. As French scholar Louis Eisenman put it in his classic 1904 study, for centuries, Hungary has led a double existence, one in reality and another in its laws. These laws had preserved the legal fiction of its sovereignty. It is this legal fiction which the laws of 1867 have turned into a reality, unquote. So this discourse about the nature of sovereignty in the Habsburg Empire involved a conception of statehood that could hover between fiction and reality, because sovereignty had never been formally ceded or legitimately overridden. According to these arguments, the empire contained a collection of slumbering states, suspended states, swallowed up but not dissolved in the python of empire. This is how Karel Kramář, later Czechoslovakia's first prime minister, put it. discussing the centralizing reforms of Maria Theresa in the 18th century. So this is an example of one of these sorts of arguments from the late 19th century, but he's looking back to this period of centralization in the 18th century. So he writes, and because she was formally and materially in the wrong, she could only produce a fact, but not a law. And for that reason, the rights of the Bohemian crown, the Bohemian Staatsrecht, the right to the unity and inseparability of the three lands of the Bohemian crown, to their legislative and administrative independence and autonomy, is not abrogated, but rather persists wholly and completely in law. A law, though it may be effectively withdrawn from practice, can never ever be abrogated by a fact, even if that fact, is a piece of legislation. That is the immovable basis of Bohemian Staatsrecht. In recent times, our interest in paper states, fictional states, juridical states has gravitated towards different parts of the colonial and post-colonial world. It can be easy to forget that European history, too, is likewise littered with juridical states, clutching at a life primarily in law. The survival of various forms of slumbering and suspended sovereignty within the empire and the path of these semi-sovereign entities into a post-imperial age allow us to connect Central European history to parallel processes elsewhere, whether we look to the Indian princely states, once dubbed hollow crowns and theatre states by Nicholas Dirks, to the autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire, or to myriad other cases. Okay. Moving on now to the sort of second half of the book, which follows what happens after the empire collapses. As we all know, in 1918, the empire dissolved under the pressure of 4 years of total war. The First World War and the imperial dissolutions at its conclusion represented a multi-sided crisis of legitimacy. The shock of state collapse and the vacuums left in its wake required an immense intellectual mobilization in pursuit of orientation, sense, order, and legitimacy. This crisis was especially acute for law. Why? In our modern positivist understanding, law is made by the state and enforced by the state. The state anchors the legal order. A state's collapse thus threatened law's collapse. How could states just end and start? Where did law's validity come from? What lay behind the first law? How could a small band of mortal men gather in a room, call themselves a constituent assembly, and make sounds with their mouths and scribble shapes with their pens that ostensibly carried the weight and force of binding law? There was no emperor now, clad in robes and crowns, the wearable vessels of an age-old legitimacy accumulated over centuries and connected somewhere in the deep mists of time to divine sanction. No props or smoke screens of the majesty of sovereignty, that presumed fount of man-made law. Sovereignty had nowhere to hide. All those questions about the ultimate basis of law, about the nature of the state, stared everyone nakedly in the face. As representatives from the new states Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Austria turned up to present their claims on the world stage, they had to find ways of legally explaining what had happened and legally justifying their new states and their territorial claims. That work had begun already in earlier phases of the war. In my work abroad, the Czech leader Tomáš Masaryk explained, I was always careful to cast our political program into a juridical form, since I had in mind the legal and international problems that would arise at the peace conference. He understood that careful attention needed to be given not only to the de facto emergence of the Czechoslovak state, but also the circumstances that gave it de jure, lawful, formal existence. That is to say, and I'm quoting him, how our historical and natural right to an independent state was recognized by the Allies and afterwards by the Central Powers, and how our revolution abroad and at home was legalized. He understood all too well that an appeal to sort of airy natural rights, like the right to self-determination, was not sufficient for several reasons. The legal status of such a revolutionary right remained very ambiguous, and the victorious allies, with their own empires to think about, were hardly going to endorse it as a universal entitlement. Moreover, self-determination could not carry the load of legitimation alone, also because the region's intermingled population meant that all such claims would be territorially overlapping. So representatives from Czechoslovakia and Hungary did something else instead. Highly conscious of the fraught nature of conjuring new sovereigns, they emphasized that no such juridical magic was necessary in the case at hand. This was not the spooky mystery of the emergence of a legal something out of a legal nothing. On the contrary, they argue that their states already existed in law. So they reused arguments they developed in the framework of imperial constitutional debate to legitimize their new states. With the collapse of the Habsburg dynasty, they now argued that these sleeping states simply reawakened, re-emerged from a long slumber into full sovereignty and full international standing, with imperial rule merely an interregnum, a factual interruption of several hundred years. As Masaryk put it, starting from the historical rights of the lands of the Bohemian crown, which entitled us to the complete restoration of our state, I explained that, de jure, our state had never ceased to exist. The Czech state, he's saying, already exists in law. It simply needs to be revived into full material life. Our state, in fact, has never lost its continuity of rights. Hungarian statesmen used the same arguments. In the argument of the Hungarian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, I quote them, "We wish, first of all, to establish the fact that Hungary is no new state born of the dismemberment of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. As far as public law is concerned, the Hungary of today is the same state she has been through her past of 1,000 years. She kept her position as an independent state upon entering into a union with Austria and during the whole existence of this union known by the name of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy," end quote. So 1918 represented a return to a deep pre-imperial status quo rather than a revolutionary rupture. States were, according to these arguments, extremely hard to kill in law. Political arguments developed in the framework of imperial constitutional debate were thus scaled up from imperial to international law, redirected from Vienna to Paris. By paying close attention to the legal language and the legal narratives used to explain the end of imperial sovereignty and the emergence of new states in its wake, my book recovers an unfamiliar story about the afterlives of imperial constitutional law in the interwar international order. In so doing, it also places Central Europe at the heart of one of the 20th century's signal stories. Because in subsequent decades, state natality and mortality was about to become a global mass phenomenon as decolonization remade the map of the world in the decades after World War II. Contemporaries spoke of an explosion of new states. In 1920, there had been just 42 member states of the League of Nations. In 1950, the United Nations had 60. But in 1960, it had 99. And in 1990, 159. I think there are just over 200 today. So I think we're only just beginning to grapple with the significance of this transformation for the world of ideas. We have so far only the beginnings of an intellectual history of decolonization. And in thinking forward from this earlier round of imperial dissolution, an unfamiliar story about the justification of new sovereignty emerges into view. Because those legal stories about sovereignty suspended and resurrected, surviving empire and coming out the other side, now morphed into scripts for international legal politics around the globe. An enormous jurisprudence on the very idea of old states and new states emerged into view. Jurists from India, Indonesia, Algeria, and elsewhere rejected the idea that their states were new, with all its connotations of contingency and conditionality. They too argued that their polities reverted to a sovereignty they had held prior to colonial rule. Ram Prakash Anand, one of India's most important international jurists in this period and a key protagonist in struggles over decolonization, phrased it this way: colonization during the 18th and 19th centuries eclipsed rather than extinguished the international legal personality of the colonized countries. So to recall their earlier sovereignty was to relativize colonialism in time. In international law, the term colonization merely meant temporary legal incapacity of once sovereign actors, unquote. Or in the words of Upendra Baxi, another important Indian jurist from this period, in international law, the term colonization merely meant temporary legal incapacity of, from the perspective of human history, the colonial epoch can be regarded as being no more than a brief interlude in the historical life of the colonized nations. With suspended sovereignty now revived, post-colonial states rejoined the international legal community, not as juvenile newcomers, but as equals, right? That was the intention of arguments like this. This story involves figures moving between these cases. For example, I spent some time reconstructing the trajectory of Charles Alexandrovitz, who was born in 1902 in Habsburg, Lemberg, Lvov, whose circuitous career took him from interwar Poland to London, where he worked for the Polish government in exile during World War II, and then to Madras, where he was a professor of law. There in India, in the immediate aftermath of independence, and in close contact with Indian jurists and archives, he developed the influential reversion to sovereignty thesis, arguing that the sovereignty of post-colonial states like India and Sri Lanka was not new, contingent, or qualified, but that they instead reverted back to the full degree of sovereignty they had enjoyed prior to colonial rule. The final section of the book traces how these themes returned to Europe in the 1990s in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. As the USSR, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia came apart, and as the two Germanys merged back together, the question of the birth, death, and continuity of states roared back into the center of European politics. Once again, when asked if states were old or if they were new, when asked if states had ceased or if they had survived, when asked if sovereignty once lapsed could be resurrected, when argued over whether the Russian Federation was the legal continuator of the USSR, inclusive of its seat on the UN Security Council, and whether the Baltic states really were, as they claimed, legal resurrections of their interwar selves. In charting this arc, I'm very interested in the relationship between regional experiences and the evolution of international law, and how regional particularities get coded into ideas and theories. If, in the era of the two world wars, state birth and death seemed like an especially Central European pathology, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it conversely appeared as a quintessential condition of the post-colonial world. Jurists like the Algerian Mohammed Boujawi doubted whether the rules developed in Europe could be usually applied to the global South. Now, in the 1990s, the reverse happened, as jurists wondered whether a body of international law now stamped with the experiences of post-colonial states could be appropriately brought back to Europe. In these images of sovereignty lost and found, these images of sovereignty lost and found continue to echo today in ongoing struggles over Indigenous rights in many settler colonies, a current frontier in debates about decolonization and self-determination. We continue to challenge, and I'm quoting here, we continue to challenge the idea that somewhere we have lost our international juridical status as nations and peoples, writes the Indigenous Australian law professor and activist Irene Watson. Aboriginal people, she writes, and I quote her again, come to international law as pre-existing, already formed and arrived entities, unquote. In its work on Indigenous rights in the 1990s, the UN's Commission on Human Rights agreed. Of those Indigenous peoples seeking the juridical status of nations, I quote them, it must be presumed until proven otherwise that they continue to enjoy such status. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, a major Indigenous submission for Australian constitutional reform, holds that the ancient sovereignty of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and I quote, never ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown, unquote. The time shrinking of imperial rule and the time expansion of original sovereignty take on monumental new proportions. How could it be otherwise, asks the Uluru Statement, that peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history merely in the last 200 years? Thank you.